Hey, I told you I would do a soldering video once I got this thing foiled and ready to solder. So I'm going to use my Weller 100 today. I'm going to go over some of the things with these things. Every once in a while you really need to take these tips off and clean them. Now this one has been neglected for a while, and in fact it's so neglected that the tip won't even come off of it. Well, good thing is I have new ones of these if you ever tear it up, and we can fix it. Now some of the maintenance things is basically taking the end off of this. What you want to do is you want to take some isopropyl alcohol and put a little bit on a paper towel, and you want to clean this end of it. These soldering irons have a 700-degree tip on it, and if you can see that little bitty number on there, that's a 7. That denotes that this is 700 degrees, and that's what temperature this thing is going to run at, which is good because I'm going to do copper foil. We're going to use 60-40 solder, which melts at about 650 to 700 degrees, which 700 makes a very good flow rate. All right, y'all. My soldering iron's heated up now. So, as I said, when I was looking at it, it does kind of look pretty dirty. Now, one of the things that I do that a lot of people don't do is I don't use a sponge. I don't like using sponges. The problem is it's wet. When you go to wipe your soldering iron off, it cools your soldering iron off, and then you have to wait for it to warm back up. So I like to use paste flux. What you do with paste flux is you just barely dip the tip in it, and then you wipe it off on a paper towel. Now, the problem with this soldering iron is it's been abused. It got put to bed without solder on the tip, so it has some pretty bad little carbon deposits on there. Now sometimes that happens if you accidentally leave your soldering iron on for a long period of time. You just don't want to do that. So I want to get this off. So I'm going to use what's known as sal ammoniac. This bar is kind of like sandpaper for a soldering iron. Alright, so to get this off of here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and rub the edges of this. And you'll notice the black on the sal ammoniac. And you'll notice that now that side is clean. Got a little bit more on this side. I'll rub it. And that side is clean. Now if you tend to have problems with the solder not wanting to pick up and stick to your iron like that, one of the other things you can do is re-tin it, which you also want to use a sal ammoniac bar. Take a little bit of solder and put it on your tip, and then rub that into the soldering iron. And what that'll do is it'll re-tin the tip so that it is ready to hold. I'll wipe that off on the paper towel. Now you see how nice and clean that is, and it's ready to go. A little bit more crud on there. Alright. Now one of the things that you really want to do is when you do turn your soldering iron off, you want to leave some solder on it. And you'll notice this tip has a little bit of solder on it. What that does is it'll protect that tip. That way if it does happen to rub up against something, or as it cools down, it won't tarnish, and that solder will protect it. Alright, so the first thing we need to do before we start soldering is we need to put some flux on here. And what the flux is going to do is it's going to allow the solder to stick to the copper. What it does is it actually deprives the solder of oxygen, and when there's no oxygen available, it'll allow it to stick to the copper. Now what I'm going to use is what's called classic gel flux. I like using this stuff. It doesn't smoke. There's no real odor to it. It's not nearly as messy as that runny stuff. The other thing is you really don't want to put runny stuff on here, because what happens is it runs through the piece. When you use this type flux, it'll sit right on top of it, and then when you apply that soldering iron, it will melt and then run through, and the solder will chase it. And that's exactly what you want. You want the solder to chase the flux going through so that it penetrates and in fact materializes underneath at the bottom. Alright, so I try not to put too much of this flux out at one time. So what I do is I put it into a little baby food jar. I put me a little paper towel on it so I don't get flux all over my fingers. And I recommend to people just starting out soldering, you want to go in and flux all your joints first so that you can tack them. Now, I usually put a pretty good little amount on my joints when I do them. I'm just going to do these few joints right here just to kind of show you what I'm talking about and how I solder. Alright, so I've got these few done. I'm going to set this aside. Now, the other thing is when I go to use solder, it comes in a big roll like this. This weighs 1 pound. I learned from my father, who did it for 45 years. Well, he ended up having carpal tunnel in his left hand, not in his right. And we figured out why it was because he always loved to hold this big 1 pound roll in his hand while he was soldering, gripping it. So we try to not do that. And so what I do is I unroll the solder and I clip me a piece off like this. And that way I have a piece of solder to hold in my hand, not nearly as heavy. And I can change my grip on it so that it's not the same thing over and over again. Now, before I really get soldering, I want to talk to you about solder. I'm using a 60-40 solder. I like to use 60-40 when I'm doing copper foil. It melts at about 650, 700 degrees, and it gives me a really good flow. Now, there are other solders. There's a 50-50. 50-50 actually has more lead in it. What that does is it allows the solder to melt at a lower point. Drops it down between 600 and 650. Now, generally, when I'm using lead, I use 50-50 because it's closer to the melting point of the lead. Whereas 60-40 melts at a higher rate, I end up melting the lead before I melt the solder sometimes. All right. So we use Ameriway. I really like Ameriway solder. It's clean. It's not recycled solder. And in fact, over the years, we've used it long enough now that I've never seen any problems with it. You know, you buy some of these cheaper brand, well, not even cheaper, they're still expensive, but some of these off-brand Chinese solders, there's a lot of impurities in it. And what happens over the years is those impurities start to wick themselves out of the solder and create yucky spots on your solder. So if you want to make a really good heirloom quality stained glass, I would stick with a good quality solder. And this is made in the USA. All right. So when I go to solder, one of the first things I like to do, and I'm going to slide the soldering iron over here so you can kind of, now that I've got flux on my piece, I've got my solder, I've got my soldering iron ready to go. I'm going to take it and I'm going to clean it first, and I'm going to wipe the tip off. Now, when you go to do these joints, what you want to do is you want to set the solder on the joint, set the iron on the solder. As soon as it melts, you want to pull the solder away, and then you want to count to 3. That's going to give you a good penetration, and it works a little like this. Set it, melts, 1001, 1002, 1003. All right? I'm going to do that on all these joints that I've fluxed. Once you get good at it, you don't have to count. And really, what I'm doing, I'm really watching it. If I only do it for a second, let it melt, set it, pick it up, it's really, you can see the solder is kind of sitting on top. And really, I don't want to go back to that yet because I haven't really gotten any heat into it, but I have gotten it warm. The key is you don't want to go back to the same spot over and over and over again. The first time you get to it, you may move that glass up to about 120 degrees, but you get it too hot, you're going to end up cracking it. And by all means, you don't want to do that because generally you're not going to find that until you go to hang it up. All right, so I've waited long enough. I'm going to come back and I'm going to do this one again. And I'm going to go 1001, 1002, 1003. So this time you can see how that solder kind of flowed down into the joint. All right, I'm going to keep going. All right, so now I'm purposely going to do a joint that doesn't have any solder on it, just so that you can see what it looks like. I'm going to set the solder on, I'm going to set the iron on, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3. Now, notice how that solder is just sitting on top of the glass. That is because it will not stick to it. Now, it may be stuck to the foil, but it won't penetrate because there's nothing to help it flow. So I'm just going to wipe just a little bit of flux on there. I'm going to go back, set it on it, 1001, 1002, 1003. And you can see the difference that flux makes when you put it on a piece. All right. So generally I do all the joints first. Now as a new stained glass artist, I recommend that. Get all your pieces connected so that they don't move around on you first. And it's always easier to take the frame off of it once you've got those joints done. And that way you can get down here and get to work on your piece where you don't have these pieces, especially if you're using horseshoe nails that may be standing up where you can't get your hands down here. It just kind of makes it easier to hold it. Now, I have been doing this for quite a while now, and I don't just tack all my joints. I actually put a bead and solder it at the same time. But you have to be very good at controlling your solder to do that. I don't recommend this. I recommend doing all your joints and then going back and filling in everything nice and smooth. So I'm going to show you how I would go about that, filling it in and being nice and smooth. So I'm going to put a little bit more flux on here, and I'm going to do these pieces. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the iron and I'm going to set it back on here again, and I'm going to start pulling it. Now what I'm watching for is behind back here, behind the soldering iron, I am watching for it to start leveling out. And when it starts leveling out, I know that I need to add a little bit more solder to it. Now, if this had more gaps in it, you would see that easier. You're going to have to really look pretty close to see it. But what I'm doing is I'm just taking my time. I don't want to get in a hurry doing this. I remember you still want to do that 3-second rule due to the fact is you want to make sure that you're penetrating. What we're hoping to see is when I flip this over, you're going to see solder coming out from the other side, and it's going to be hitting the paper on the back. All right? I'll do another one here. Needs more. Needs a little more. Needs a little more. All right, I'm going to start pulling down. Needs more. See, now this one you can tell. As soon as it starts to get low, I add a little bit more solder to it. What I'm watching for is that seam to emerge. Now when I get to a joint, I really don't have to worry about it, but see now it's starting to gotten low again, so I'm just going to add a little bit more solder to it. Just like that. I'm going to let it cool off. Okay? Now I'm going to finish this piece, and then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to show you the other side. To you about fluxing. So I've got the whole thing flux now. One thing that I did do is on these joints or on the edges, I stayed about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge with the flux so that when I solder, I don't get solder all the way up to the edge. Remember, once we're done with this, we're going to put a frame around it. I don't have a frame on it yet because I don't want this to set up off the ground. I want to be able to penetrate with my solder first. So when you go to solder these, you want to stay about 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, which would look a little like this. Alright. Alright, so I'm going to continue soldering here. Unfortunately, I don't have a way of speeding it up. So I'm going to pause it for a minute, and then I'm going to let it roll, but then I'm going to put it on high speed on this section. Alright. So I have this all soldered now, so I am going to flip it over. Let's see how we did. The key to this is you want to make sure that you're getting enough heat because you really need to get that solder to flow through. Now, if it doesn't flow through, that's not that big a deal, but you're going to end up having lots of bubbles this time when you go to try to do it. Alright, so I'm going to be very careful with this when I go to turn it over. Alright. So now when I set this down, if you'll notice, there is quite a bit of solder flowing through. Those are the joints to where I was able to make it flow. Now there are a few spots where it didn't flow through, and those I'm just going to need to take a little bit more time with to solder. Alright, so on this side, this is the back of the piece. I generally don't put a bead on both sides. So this side, I'm going to finish solder it with one wipe of the soldering iron. Really all I want to do is fill it in, make sure that there's no lines, and the key to that is to not dibble dabble paint. Dibble dabbling is kind of like this, going around and doing a little bit all over the place. You really want to paint like you would use a roller on your wall to paint. You want to be nice and smooth. And that's what I'm going to show you now. Alright, so I'm going to start back with another piece of solder. I'm going to start up at the top. I'm going to clean my tip before I get started. The other key is remember I don't want to start on an edge. I want to start a little ways away from it so that I have room to put my framing on it when I'm done. Alright, so I'm going to start dragging, and really all I'm looking for this time is it to be nice and flat. I'm not trying to put a bead on it, so I'm just going to kind of pull it along, filling it in, adding a little bit more solder when I need to. Now this area through here, I'm not going to need to put very much solder on it because there is already solder coming through. So really I can use most of that solder just to fill in with. I just need just enough to cap it off so that all the copper is covered. Alright? And you'll notice I did that all in one spot. I didn't come up here and do a little bit and then come back and do a little bit or do this. The problem with that is that's exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get something looking awful. You really want to take your time. Nice and slow, nice and even, nice flowing. I feel like I have curly hair and my name is Bob, but I'm not. My name is Eric. And I do have a handlebar mustache on my arm. Nice and slow. Now I left a little bit of a bead on there. Now if there are spots that you really don't like or you think you can make it look better, you can take your iron, set it on it, let it melt, and then pick it straight up. It will make that bad spot go away. Don't go back and wipe it. If you wipe it, you're not going to be happy with it. It's not going to look good. Not at all. Alright, well I'm going to continue to do this over the back of this, and then I'll turn it over and I'll show you how to do what I call beading the solder, or putting a bead on. Alright, now we're going to flip this over, see what we have. Alright, so now we're pretty much solid. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to put a bead on this side. Alright, so a bead is basically raising it up. Now I'm going to start by cleaning my soldering iron again. Now this time when I hold it, I'm going to raise up a little bit so that if you think about a soldering iron as a spoon, if you hold it like this, it's going to drag solder with it. If you hold it like this, all the solder is going to come off of it. Just like a spoon. If you hold it up, everything pours out of it. If you hold it down, everything stays in it. So this time I want to add more solder to this and get it to stand up. Alright, so one way that I do that is I start with a nice bead of solder and I kind of tilt it up and I work to just the tip of it, just like that, and stop. Now if I want to make these joints look a little bit better, I'm going to set it on it, let it melt, pick it up. Set it on it, let it melt, pick it up. Alright, one more time. I'll work my way down this way, raising it up. Adding a little bit more solder. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of looking underneath the soldering iron to see that if there's still solder there. And if there's no solder there, then I need to add a little bit more. Now I'm going to let this stop for a second. There we go. Set it on there, let it melt, pick it up. Pretty good. I hope this helps. If these videos have helped you in any way, then hey, do me a favor, share them. Thanks for watching. Make sure that you subscribe to Ed's Emporium's videos, and I'll try to do more videos as it comes. If this video helped you in any way, remember Ed's Emporium is an art glass studio, and we only make money by teaching. I know these are free, but hey, if you feel like you need to give something, you could always go to edsemporium.com and buy a gift certificate and then come back and use it. We also do sell a few things online. If you'd like to buy some supplies or buy a soldering iron or any of those things, you can contact us. Go to our website, edsemporium.com. I'll put a link at the end in the comment section. If you have any questions about soldering, hey, put those into the comments and I'll try to answer them for you. All right? Thanks for watching.